Okay, good morning and welcome to the 10th Annual Indonesia Economic Forum. Yes, it's the 10th year. And 10 years ago, Shoaib, who's here, and myself and a group of people started the Indonesia Economic Forum. And I still remember in year 4, when Pastor Andy Uno came to us, he said, "You're at year 4. That's an achievement." Today we are in year 10, and we could not have come this far without the help of a lot of people. Many of you are in the room today, but definitely Gita and Ibu Shinta, who have been on Ibu Shinta has been on our advisory board from the beginning. Gita has always been opening the sessions of Indonesia Economic Forum. So a warm round of applause for Gita and Ibu Shinta. Thank you. I'll just give you a little background about what Indonesia Economic Forum is doing now, because a lot of things have changed. We started as a conference, and we expanded into roundtables. And the pandemic forced us to shift from being an event, which is attended by between 300 and 800 people, to amplifying the messages that we have on digital. So in 2020, 2021, and 22, we were largely online. I think all of you were sick and tired of Zoom conferences. We are lucky that we are back now to a world which we are more familiar, but things have changed. We have moved into a format where we have a much more intimate setting of 20 to 25 thought leaders and opinion makers. And the session is recorded. It is broadcast live on YouTube and Zoom and on Facebook. And the real outreach of what we discuss here today is done over the next 30 days. Because there's a time zone difference, a lot of people from the US and Europe are not able to follow the session live. In fact, Gita was also supposed to be logging in from Stanford. And I got a big surprise yesterday when he said, "I'm in town and I'll be there." Great. So I would actually like to, get started. The discussion in the morning of the first day is always to set the tone and the narrative for what we do over the next 2 days. Most important part of the discussion today is basically the topic, which is unleashing the power of digitalization across the nation. As you all know, there is a broad consensus that the digital economy would be the size of $172 billion by 2030. That's an 18-fold increase. Now, that's not going to happen accidentally. There has to be a lot of deliberate action. There has to be a lot of concentrated effort in how do we actually come across a model that works sustainably so that we are able to reach $172 billion in contribution by the digital sector, which means it's not just digital companies. So far, I think digitalization has been focused on companies that are digital. You have e-commerce companies, and that's our view of what's digital. But in reality, all the traditional corporations, companies, state-owned enterprises, everybody is transforming digitally. So digital transformation is now going across to a level where it is now reaching even the far provinces and kabupatens of Indonesia. And you're looking at digital transformation happening across various sectors, right from agriculture to fisheries to food and beverage, etc. So with this kind of setting the tone for how do we get opinion leaders, decision makers, and thought leaders coming across and sharing their views will help set a kind of a narrative which we will be able to take over in 2024 through a series of roundtables, virtual discussions. Whatever we do today would be the theme for 2024 for IEF. And we also have the ASEAN Economic Forum being launched tomorrow, which would carry forward the thoughts of what's being said in this room here to across the region, to the 10 member nations of ASEAN. So we have a lot of work ahead for us. So I would like to introduce Gita. I think all of you know he doesn't need much introduction, but Gita has been the former Minister of Trade for Indonesia. He has also been in the head of BKPM. I still remember, Gita, you were the person who took Indonesia to the World Economic Forum for the first time. And that changed how Indonesia started portraying itself around the world. Today, Pak Gita is a visiting scholar at the Stanford University. I think many of you would have read that President Pak Jokowi was at Stanford, Ibu Shinta was there, Anindya Bakri, and a whole bunch of people were there at Stanford. And this speaks volumes for the kind of outreach Indonesia is now doing to get for the world more familiar with how Indonesia is playing a role in the global balance. So without much further introduction, I'm going to have Gita have a session here. But also would like to welcome Ibu Shinta. Ibu Shinta and I go back a long way. She has been supporting the Economic Forum for various kinds of topics, including sustainability. She's today the chairperson of APINDO. She has been at the Economic Forum last year in her capacity as the chair of B20, which was a part of the whole G20 hosting of Indonesia. She's been involved in a lot of various other initiatives, and we are very proud to have Ibu Shinta here today as well. So the format would be, this is basically a focus group discussion. We would have So we would have Pak Gita kick off the proceedings, and then we would have a short Q&A session, followed by Ibu Shinta would join the conversation. Okay? Thank you. So, Pak Gita, good morning. I'm your moderator here today.
Okay.
So I would like to ask you to give us your views on where you think we are heading. I think the geopolitical situation around the world has also changed a lot, and your views have always been very, not only contrarian, but sometimes embedded in truth. So what do you think is happening, and how do you feel we should connect what's happening in Indonesia with the rest of the world? Over to you, Pak Gita.
Thank you, Sachin. It's always an honor to be sitting next to Shinta, who's been, knowing me for the last few decades, ever since I was still wearing shorts. And it's always an honor for me to speak at the Indonesia Economic Forum, starting from 10 years ago. I want to just bring up 3 broad points to all of you this morning. The first is with respect to what I see as being 3 paradoxical observations. The first paradoxical observation is with regards to the internet. Several decades ago, the internet was supposed to be the equalizer for humanity, right? It did a heck of a good job in terms of democratizing information, but unfortunately, it did not democratize ideas. It did not democratize capital the way it was designed, the way it was supposed to. As a result of which, empirically, we're seeing rising Gini coefficient ratios pervasively all across the world, be it in developing economies or developed economies. You can see that in China, you can see that in the US, you can see that in Indonesia, India, Nigeria, and all the rest. The second paradoxical observation is what I call the paradox of sustainability. I spent a lot of time with experts in the fields of sustainability who, in my view, are a little too elitist in the sense that they bring about this aspiration of attaining carbon neutrality by 2050 without really being cognizant of the fact that about 85% of the population of the planet still are concerned about putting food on the table, right? And the only source of energy is really coal or anything that's carbon emitting. And it has become very, very difficult to reconcile the narrative of development, which resonates with the Indonesians of the world, the Indians of the world, the Nigerians of the world, much less the sub-Saharan people of the world, with the narrative of sustainability. Now, if you take a look how we're going to be able to reconcile the two narratives, you can put that in the context of supply and demand. On the demand side, I think it's very easy to socially architect or re-architect and re-engineer the behavior of somebody to stop using coal today, as long as the alternatives are affordable, right? So the demand side is actually a much easier piece of the equation. Whereas on the supply side, there's two elements. The first is really the technological part of the supply side. We have alternatives that could actually resolve the problem or the issue by way of solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, geothermal, and all that good stuff. But the reality is, if you speak with each one of these technologists or even entrepreneurs, they're still at a level way beyond the purchasing power of the developing countries. If you talk to most of these technologists, you know, we're talking about basically commercializing each one of these alternatives at a price of about 15 to 20 cents on a per kilowatt basis. Whereas the affordability for a typical villager in Chennai or in Banyuwangi or in Abuja is no more than 3 to 5 cents on a per kilowatt basis. So I think we'll have to really wait until technology will bring about whatever it can bring about to the table at a price that's going to be affordable. Until then, I think the irreconcilable nature of the narrative of development and the narrative of sustainability will be very difficult to remedy. Just to give you an illustration, India and Indonesia are electrified only to the extent of about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. 1,300. Singapore is at 10,000. If you want to define modernity, which is really the target or goal of any developing country, you got to be electrified to the extent of at least 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Now, you start thinking, right? What does it take to go from 1,300 to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita? You take a look at the power generation capabilities of India and Indonesia. Indonesia is at about 75 gigawatts. So it needs to be multiplied by 5 times at least so that the electrification per capita gets up to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. It will take India and Indonesia at the rate that India can only build 19,000 megawatts per year, Indonesia 3,000 megawatts per year. It will take the two countries 100 years to get to modernity. 100 years is well beyond the 27 years left until we're supposed to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. This is what's paradoxical. So I've talked about the paradox of the internet, the paradox of sustainability, and the third is really the paradox of AI, artificial intelligence. I'm spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley with technologists where I'm seeing hubris more than necessary, to the extent that these technologists are not too concerned, borderline cavalier, about roping in people of different backgrounds, people of culture, people of spirituality, people of economics, people of environment, people of morality, people of philosophy. To the extent my sense, or even sensation, is that the narrative of AI is not being ushered in an adequately multidisciplinary manner. What happens with anything when it doesn't become pushed forward in a multidisciplinary manner is that it results into a less benign consequence. And we all know that AI is basically a process of hallucination. A hallucination that's imbued by hypnosis. And hypnosis mostly coming from those with technological backgrounds, not diverse backgrounds. So there is a real risk here that it's not going to be ending up in the most judicious or benign manner. One empirical evidence or illustration of this is how OpenAI, which I know most of you are probably using, has made a decision to pivot from being closed source, from being open source to being closed source, has made a decision to pivot from being non-for-profit to for-profit. The concern with chasing profitability is that you lose balance with humanity, right? So these three paradoxical observations are what I think are going to shape the world. They're already shaping the world, and they're going to inevitably continue shaping the world. So this is the broad trend that I want to talk about. The second trend is really with respect to the global order. Most of you here, I would guess, are at least 45 years old. We were born in an era when the world was dominated by two forces, the United States and the Soviet Union. That bipolar order was basically a succession to the end of the World War II, but it preceded what we call the golden era of unipolarity. Ever since 1989, we enjoyed the era of unipolarity where one guy was able to tell everybody else what to do. We call that the multilateral era. However, since a few years ago, the global order shifted from a bipolar to a multipolar world. This multipolarity has basically come about by way of the revisionism that's been pushed by the new middle powers, inclusive of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and additionally the Turkeys of the world, the Mexicos of the world, the Nigerias of the world, and the Indonesias of the world, or even the ASEANs of the world. The irony about multipolarity is that multilateralization has become much more difficult in a multipolar world, whereas multilateralization was a lot easier in a much more unipolar world. So I think it's safe to assume that for the near foreseeable future, multilateralization is at risk. We're seeing this episodically in how India resisted in joining RCEP, in how Indonesia resisted in joining the TPP. The problem with the rejection or resentment or disillusionment with any undertaking to multilateralize is that you're forced into a position of having to bilateralize or even plurilateralize. The concern with that is when you're in a room with only one guy, you're exposed. Your weaknesses are exposed, your strengths are exposed a lot more transparently than in a much more multilateral setting. So what boils down is your ability to show marginal productivity. Whoever has more marginal productivity will win out in a bilateral negotiation. And this is where Singapore takes everybody else's lunch. Because Singapore's marginal productivity is at $200,000 on a per capita per year basis in terms of goods and services, whereas Indonesia's is only $25,000. So how do we move the needle from $25,000 to $200,000? It takes prayers, it takes burning a lot of candles, it takes burning a lot of sins, it takes chopping a lot of lambs, it takes a lot of hard work, right? And part of that hard work is to figure out how do we put money on the table. So I've talked about the first broad observation with respect to the three paradoxes, the second with respect to how we've become multipolar and how multilateralization has become much more difficult in a much more multipolar order. The third bit, I want to be much more pragmatic. I want to talk about money. It takes money to move the needle of marginal productivity. Now, in the setting of Indonesia, if I look at money, It's basically manifested in three metrics: the ratio of money supply to the GDP, the ratio of banking asset to the GDP, and the ratio of the capital markets to the GDP. Each one of these three is at around 45%. To give you a clue, that does not compare well with Singapore. I'm not trying to sound like the marketing director of Singapore here, but Singapore's ratios, those three ratios, are at near 200%. If there is a guy with a great idea in Pulau Rote, if that idea can be attached to money, he or she has a good chance of becoming as good, if not better, than Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. But the problem is, as much as he has a great idea, better yet, better idea than Jeff Bezos is, he or she does not have as good a chance as Jeff Bezos to be a Jeff Bezos, if not better. Because that idea or that great idea cannot be glued to money at the rate that your money supply to GDP ratio is only at 45%. So the only way for the middle powers to become better or bigger than middle would be to attain capital formation, right? Capital formation in a typical developing country like Indonesia cannot take place domestically. It can only take place externally or internationally. At the rate that the Indonesians learn to pick up an international language, at the rate that the Indonesians learn to understand what is it that defines capital formation, I think we could be a LeBron James in the next 20 to 30 years. But the problem is we're not there yet. Less than 10% of the population of Indonesia speak English, right? I've always been thinking to simplify the goal for Indonesia to be LeBron James. Sorry, I have a female next to me. To be a Michelle Wee. We got to figure out how to get at least 100 million Indonesians to speak English. This is why we keep losing our lunch to the Singaporeans and the Indians, right? I speak with authority because I lived in India for 3 years. And the Singaporeans and the Indians, they know this. They have a competitive advantage because they can communicate with the world. Until and unless we have 100 million Indonesians being able to speak an international language, we're going to be shackled. Until and unless 400 million people in Southeast Asia can speak an international language, we're all going to be shackled. So that's the first. The second is the educational attainment. I look at the educational attainment in two categories. The first is really the non-tertiary stuff. It's manifested empirically in PISA. PISA is the measurement of the 15-year-olds attaining lingual proficiency and STEM proficiency. Indonesia scores 71st out of 80 countries measured. Singapore is number 2, China is number 1, and all of a sudden, now Vietnam, out of the blue, has shot up and is positioned at number 2 in Southeast Asia after Singapore. Singapore and Vietnam in Southeast Asia are the two countries that have been able to score above the global average, whereas the rest, inclusive of Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, of course, Brunei, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, are way below the global average. So think about that. If the 15-year-olds are not attaining the global average for PISA purposes, on top of the fact that they do not speak an international language, how the hell are they going to be able to attain capital formation? And the reality is, most of the capital right now is sitting in Western liberal democracy countries. I call that M2, money supply. Money supply in the United States and all the other Western liberal democracy countries, inclusive of Japan and South Korea, and to some extent China, which is not a liberal democracy country, amount to more than $100 trillion. $100 trillion, which is about 100 times the GDP of Indonesia. So we've got systemic limitations with money supply to GDP of only 45%. We've got to go out and get the capital from all these countries that have, until 18 months ago, been exposed to an interest rate environment of less than 1%. Okay? But they didn't reallocate the capital to us. They decided to just move the capital within themselves or amongst themselves. This is paradoxical. Why did they not do that? It's simple. I've studied this. I'm hypothesizing. Capital formation is not a function of ideology. It's not a function of geography. It's not a function of whether or not there are natural resources. But it's a function of how trustworthy the system is. And let me give you some empirical evidence here. I call this FDI, foreign direct investment. The FDI on a per capita per year basis for Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam ranges between $100 to $400. $100 to $400. Anybody know what it is for Singapore? $19,000. On a relative basis, they stack up, way up there. On an absolute basis, in 2021, which is only 2 years ago, Singapore was able to get $105 billion worth of FDI. The next biggest recipient was Indonesia that got only $30 billion. So in absolute and relative terms, Singapore took everybody else's lunch in Southeast Asia. Why do people put money in Singapore? It's not because of an ideology that resonates. It's because you trust the system. As much as the interest rate environment until 18 months ago would have been around 1%. The enforceability of rules and regulations is imperative. We cannot just stop at defining what it takes to attain capital by way of bureaucratic reform. We've got to be resolute. We've got to be more deterministic about this in terms of how can we, the 9 other countries in Southeast Asia, figure out so that we become much more trustworthy in the context of the enforceability of rules and regulations. To the extent not, we're exposed. So that's the third bit. The last bit, just to lead up to the digitization of the region, inclusive of Indonesia, I think it's safe to assume that the baseline growth rate trajectory for Southeast Asia is about 5%. That's just on the back of sheer demographics, scale, and how we can basically communicate with the rest of the world. China has become the largest trading partner of every Southeast Asian country, every Asian country with the exception of Bhutan, and there's no stopping that. But this is bereft of additional attributes of what I call the game-changing innovation disruptions. I call them AI, genomics, blockchain, robotics, and energy storage. Many pundits around the world have pontificated that the value creation just coming from AI in the next 10 to 15 years will amount to about 50 to $100 trillion. 50 to $100 trillion in the next 10 to 15 years. The rest, in terms of blockchain, genomics, energy storage, and robotics, another $100 trillion. So just imagine if we did whatever I suggested we would have to do in terms of attaining a foreign language, in terms of being educated at the non-tertiary and at the tertiary levels. There is no reason for us not to be able to capture just a little bit, if not more, of that 50 to $100 trillion worth of AI economic value creation. If we didn't do that, they're all going to accrue to China and the US. Mark my word. So the onus is really upon us to pinch ourselves in the cheek and awaken ourselves that we got to do what we got to do. But it's actually quite simple. We just need to learn how to communicate internationally a little bit better in a continuously multipolar world. And number two, we got to get ourselves better educated. In the 80s, we had 16,000 Indonesians studying at all the universities in the US. Right now, we only have 8,500. We have 400 to 450,000 Chinese studying at all universities in the US. We have about 150 to 200,000 Indians. We got about 100 to 150 Koreans. In 2021, those that got a PhD in STEM in the US, PhD in STEM, 6,500 came from China, 2,500 from India, 1,300 from Korea, 430 from Turkey. You know how many from Indonesia? 82. You want to know how many from Ghana? 113. Anybody know where Ghana is? Last time I checked, it's not a member of the G20. So these are simple factoids, right? Which I think we need to just be sensitive to and take a view on. I want to end with an optimistic tone. I've seen how we measure up to the Singapores of the world. I've seen how we measure up to the other developing economies. There are so many, or so few rather, low-hanging fruit variables that we can just pick on and take a view on. Now, if we did that, there's no reason for us not to be able to usher whatever narrative that will lead up to a golden era for not just Indonesia, but for Southeast Asia by 2045. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Gita. I think that's, I would say, it's fair to say that it sets a very good tone for an interesting discussion. Does anybody want to go first with a question for Pak Gita? Or should I ask the first one? So Pak Gita, in your view, you've been at the BKPM, you've been involved in how Indonesia is participating, and you've been the narrator of Indonesia across the world. And especially now in your role in Stanford, I'm sure you would be doing the same thing. What do you think is a starting point? Let's say we want to get actionable about these issues. Where would you think we should start? How do we go about in 2024 onwards? How does the government, the private sector, the public sector, or the academia, etc. How do we actually get our grips on a starting point to head in the right direction?
Well, I kind of alluded to it. The obvious is language, right? If you had asked me 3 to 5 years ago as to when or how long it's going to take us to get 100 million Indonesians to be able to speak an international language, my answer would have probably been 20 to 30 years. This was before I realized how quickly the AI bandwagon was moving. Having seen the speed with which the AI bandwagon has been moving, I sit here feeling a lot more optimistic. There's no reason for Indonesia not to have 100 million people being able to speak an international language in the next 5 to 10 years. I'm actually involved on the board of a tech company that's going to help with as many Indonesians as possible and as many Southeast Asians as possible to be able to speak an international language. It's proven to be really, really good. So that's the first. The second, anything we want to do involves money, right? Fulus, ujung-ujungnya duit, right? Without money, you're not going to be able to achieve whatever you want to achieve. So we've got to be, I think, much more deterministic about what it takes to get money. And we've got to be realistic where the money is. The money is not in Indonesia. It's not, okay? At the rate that the money is not in Indonesia, it will just continue to elitize. The select few that have access to capital will continue to rise at the expense of the rest. Now, that's not the kind of future that we all want, right? We want, I think, a much broader-based economic development. So, and we know that there is more than $100 trillion worth of liquidity out there. But the problem is, every cent, every penny of this $100 trillion is actually being managed by financial allocators that have fiduciary responsibility. They have to be fiduciary to the financial capital holders. They're not going to be able to recklessly allocate capital to just anybody in Kalimantan or whatever without being able to be accountable. So the onus is upon us to make sure that we can be held accountable for this capital formation. How do we hold ourselves accountable? We got to make sure that the rule of law works. The rule of law is highly correlated with the concept of IRR, internal rate of return. Money chases return. Return is defined by what I call rule of law. At first, at the most foundational level. Beyond that, it's the alpha and the beta. But before we get to the alpha and the beta, we got to get very much more foundational. That the systems need to be trusted. To the extent they're not, that money is going to behave like water. Water chases gravity. Gravity is being defined by rule of law. So those are the two basic things I think that Indonesia needs to be really, really resolute about. The rest, you know, I don't need to tell you. I mean, I was in Korea, I was giving a talk 3 days ago. I was asked a similar question. When you've got $100 trillion out there within Korea, Japan, Canada, the US, Western European countries, and China, I think you want to make sure that the rule of law works. The rest, I think, is academic. Money is going to chase after whatever investment thesis. So that's what I think countries like Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries need to work on.
Thank you, Bagita. In fact, I have, Nalin, you want to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, Bagita. I have been hearing you for the last 7 years at the IEF, and you continue to, you know, astound with your insights. I have two questions. They are on diverse topics. I share your optimism that AI will accelerate Indonesia's journey into, you know, internationalizing its workforce or tapping into that big market out there. Having worked for 5 years in the skilling sector in Indonesia, I feel there is a unwilling learner issue. How do we overcome that mindset? That's one question. And the second one is geopolitical. Having lived more than the 45 years you alluded to, whatever is happening in the Middle East, is there a less hysterical reaction this time? Is it maturity or fatigue?
I'll start off with the second question, because this is still fresh in my mind. I just gave a talk on this in Korea. I think it's important for anybody to consider winning the peace as being far more important than winning the war. An empirical example of that is Vietnam, where the US actually lost the war, but they actually won the peace. If you talk to any Vietnamese right now, they're some of the most ardent supporters of the United States. They decided to jump on this TPP bandwagon for purposes of containment with respect to China. They're signing up a free trade agreement with the US on a whim. I'm in a camp that believes that the United States is having a tough time embracing multipolarity. And this is on the back of we in Southeast Asia, we in Asia, have a much easier time dealing with multipolarity. I would argue that in the last 2,000 years, Southeast Asia has been grazed by Buddhism for 400 years, Hinduism for 600 years, colonization, Islam, Christianity, independence, thereafter democratization for 700 years with relatively very low bloodshed. Empirically, in Southeast Asia, in the last 2,000 years, there's only been 9 million lives lost. By way of differences in views with respect to ethnicity, race, and religion. That speaks of tremendous peace and stability in the region. That means we grapple with multipolarity in a really cool way. That's a stark comparison to, forgive me for saying this, our European friends. In the last 2,000 years, there's been 190 million lives lost by way of differences in views and opinions with respect to ethnicity, race, and religion. 120 million of which died in the first 2 world wars in a span of 35 years, right? So that, to me, tells me that I think we're having an easier time embracing multipolarity. So with respect to what's happening in Ukraine, with respect to what's happening in West Asia, I tell my American friends, I tell my Israeli friends, I tell my Jewish friends, that whatever you do, it's important to win the peace. Don't get too bogged down with winning the war, because winning the war might end up with not winning the peace in the short term, in the midterm, and the long term. I'm in a camp that also believes that at the rate that the United States is going to struggle in embracing multipolarity much more difficultly than we in India, in Southeast Asia, and the rest of Asia, I'm also in the camp that believes that China has proven itself to be a better embracer of multipolarity in the last 2,000 years. By way of its sheer homogeneity, 92% Han, they've been able to, I think, embrace multipolarity in a much better way than most people around the world. I think the onus is really upon our friends in the US and Western European countries. Until such time, then I think there could be some episodic stresses that could create a risk premium that some of us or many of us are not going to be able to embrace. So that's my answer on the first. On the second, whereas on the first, sorry, I forget, what was the first? Oh yeah, the unwilling learner mentality, to some extent it's correlated with the incentives. I've been in enough situations where if there is enough incentive, anybody is willing to do anything, barring certain morality, boundaries. And you gotta basically figure out a way to tweak the incentives. And you gotta basically able to prove that AI is gonna lead up to something tangible. I'm in the camp that believes that AI is not going to be too easy for us in Southeast Asia. I mean, I spent enough time with people in Silicon Valley. Now there's a splintering of the OpenAI mafia, the way we saw with the PayPal mafia about 20 years ago. They're all going to Salesforce, Amazon, Google, Meta, and whatever, right? At the end of the day, it's the guy that has the most money that's going to be able to propel AI more, better, higher than the others. What that tells me is that it's not a software challenge. It's an engineering challenge. It's a hardware challenge. So whoever can muscle more than the others will win in the AI battle. But again, I underline my earlier point. There is a sense that people are actually pushing the narrative in a too technological manner as opposed to multidisciplinary manner. So anybody that can basically put money on the table as to push forward this engineering process better and more strongly than the others, that guy is going to win. And that, I think, applies to Southeast Asia. But in my view, pragmatically speaking, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're not going to be able to create of AI by way of the monetary limitations. We're just going to be a user or an enabler. We're not going to be a creator.
Thank you. Ibu Shinta, if I may ask you to say a few words on the point that Pagita made about money and the availability of capital, and the right way to put it is attain capital formation.
Sorry, Sachin, because I prepared a presentation. Should we just ini what Pagita
you want that?
Should we move, I don't know. Should we move to that? Okay.
Yes, let's move to that.
Okay, because I know that your time is also very limited, right? I just wanna say after what Pagita, it's always inspiring, and we are always triggered, right? After such a conversation and sharing his views. I spent the last week or so, I told Pagita, with a lot of the economic team of the candidates, because they are now kind of formulating their programs. And, one thing when we talk about Indonesia, and after hearing from Pagita, I always feel like there's this big gap, Pagita, You're like up there, and it's true. And we're here talking about what's happening, to these people in areas that doesn't even have access to digitalization. What I mean is, we're talking about Indonesia wanting to reach and golden year 2045, Indonesia maju, and with the growth of 7% annually that we need to achieve. How are we on earth going to do that when we are so behind in both two aspects, which is the human capital and the productivity? And a lot of the things that Pagita mentions, definitely including capital, are still very far from where we are today. So perhaps what I want to share is more the Indonesian context of where we're sitting today. And I've been very excited to look at where is actually our next leaders going to bring us. I mean, are we going to ever move somewhere? I mean, do we see progress? I think progress is there, but I think the pace maybe is way too slow. And looking into talking about all these economic programs, we just had a session specifically on digitalization yesterday with all the three candidates team. We realized that, wow, I wish Pagita is there sitting and tell them what to do, really. We're just still standing and talking about the same issues that we're facing. So I just want to, just share some slides. I know a lot of the information maybe but I want to come maybe from the business side. Why is so important for us when we talk about digitalization, know digitalization? We're not talking about just the industry. We're talking about all the sectors. And we clearly know that, manufacturing, agriculture, all the top sectors of Indonesia have to move into this in order for us to make that leap. So I think if we look at the Indonesia digital economic landscape that we already all know, we see, that the numbers is, of course, we have the largest digital savvy population globally. We have the fourth highest number of internet users. I think in 2023, we have 230 million, or 77% of country, 217 million people were active internet users. We're also looking into reaching $77 billion in digital economy, and it's on course to reach 130 billion by 2025. So we do have a very big demand and potentials, and not just potential, but really we are moving there, if we look at the population that we have. But again, this is what Pagita said. Indonesia will never become a digital creator, right? We are just an enabler for growth and an engine for value creation to the Indonesian economic sector. And I think we are still short of growth of 7%. In order to do that, all business, all sectors need to go into digitalization and move towards their structural reform. So if we'll addressing some of the structural issue in the next slide, we can see that many, like many other developing nations as well, I think we see that the biggest issue of digitalization adoption is inclusivity and the widening gap in digital adoption for marginalized group. This is definitely a big issue. 97% of our economy is SMEs. And how on earth are we going to do this if without them being, being part of the story and have this structure issue. So some of these issues that I wanted to share, we've talked about yesterday also with it was so funny because yesterday we have the minister, Pak Budi Adi, we have also Minister Sri Mulyani, and then she was telling Pak Budi, I already give you all the money now to build your infrastructure, BTS and so forth. So you better deliver, all of that. And then Pak Budi said, the money doesn't come to me. It was before. So now I have to just clean up the mess. That's what he said. So it's like I think it's digital infrastructure. I think it's definitely still a big issues. And when we talk about internet, we've known it's not just internet access, but we also know the kecepatan, the speed of the internet, which is ridiculous, of course. So we talk about the access, but we also need to look at affordability. I think those two are very important. The slide before, please. And then also we talk about the digital literacy. I think this is something that is still a very, very big issue for Indonesia. And I think it's not, this is even in the business itself. When we do the rescaling because of jobs, the upscaling, I think this is still an issue. Cost of trial and error of tech adoption. I think with the limited access and ability to finance affordable technology, I think this is also a big issue. And burdening of adapting work models, especially in involving hybrid work, education, reallocation of workers, and so forth. Also, protection of basic digital rights and cybersecurity. I think this is something that we have to really pay understanding the digital rights and efforts to protect them is very important, including regulatory measure, operational aspect of the company, cybersecurity, and so forth. And this is a topic I really love to talk about, which is the gender disparity. I think narrowing the gap in internet access and digital literacy for women and utilization of technology to expand for expanding business owners, which is 61% of the MSME are really gender women, but only 17% of them have the presence in e-commerce platforms. So this is still a very big issue. So what are some of the key determining factors for a successful technology-based digitalized company? I think we all know the ICT infrastructure, the human capital, also the business climate and cyber security. I think research and development and innovation, of course, the funding and investment, we talk about the money, and the policy and regulations. I want to also touch a few things. We did a survey actually about 2,000 companies for our economic roadmap. And the whole purpose of the economic roadmap is for us to submit a clear, this is coming from business, so this is not economic roadmap that presented by the economists. It's really from business, so it's the language of business. And the idea is to give inputs, and we have done this every 5 years, to give inputs to the candidates, which is included sectoral and non-sectoral issues. And the inputs including the policy metrics, because there's a lot of also regulations that are entailing in terms of the doing business. So this is something that we've worked together with all businesses, including also the foreign chambers and we will launch this and have a dialogue with the candidates in the coming weeks. But I think we really clearly see that in the next slide that adoption of digital tools across businesses is still limited, and Indonesia's startup ecosystem has been rapidly deteriorating. This is very interesting, as depicted, I think, by the startup genome. The Jakarta historical ranking startup ecosystem has been declining from number 2 to number 12. And companies across Indonesia also validate this concern. So this is something that we come up with our survey as well, where 52% respondents from our survey agree that startup ecosystem in Indonesia is at emerging stage. Many startups are established, but operations are still subscale. This is the biggest issue. So we come up with many startups. Jadi what we call it now with SMEs juga, we don't want to just create SMEs, but SME naik kelas kita bilang, you know, they have to grow. And also, I think Indonesia is still demonstrating lagging cybersecurity system. I think currently ranked at number 85 between the national cybersecurity index. This is further also validated by the survey where 20% of companies are not satisfied with the current cybersecurity practices. The next slide, we find in the survey that 4 key challenges that the MSME hold from adopting technology or digital tools. First, the limited literacy knowledge and capability along the technology and tools needed. Second is the lack of understanding of possible digital applicability for the business and its benefit. So there is still lack of understanding, believe it or not, on this. The third is limited budget to invest, I think money again, the budget to invest hardware, software, and also operations. And the fourth also is frequent network and signal problem, hindering the MSME to keep using technology and digital tools. And the survey has found that businesses are eager to adopt. So we have come to many of the specific sectors that are eager to adopt, and this is the top sectors that we have. So we survey over 2,000 companies, I think from various sectors, and we find that these are some of the sectors that are clearly, wanting to do the adoption. In the next slide, we also highlight the key challenges in the ICT infrastructure itself. And based on the survey, we see that 48% of the respondents are satisfied with the availability of the telecom services, but we see that 49% are satisfied with the affordability, 45% with the telecom service, and 43% are satisfied with the availability, affordability, and quality of IT hardware and software. So these are just some numbers that I would like to share with you. And of course, some of the challenges are provided there, just to have an idea where business are really coming from, and what our proposal to the government, to future government, is expanding the telecommunication network, enhancing digital talent. So we've been focusing, selamat datang Pak Sandi Uno, Pak Menteri. I'm going to be very quick because I know everybody wants to listen to Pak Sadi. But just, so these are 3 proposals that we do from APINDO. Also, the digital talent has been something that we're really focusing on. And now it's interesting because when we work with the labor union, we're not just talking about minimum wage. As you know, it's been in the media these days about minimum wage. It will be confirmed today also for the Kabupaten Regency minimum wage. But I think we are now moving towards a training, including digitalization, because something that is important is moving away from the just talking about the use of minimum wage and going more into the capacity building. So I think this is something that we're working on. And the third is affordability of hardware, software, and services. Now, I think I want to talk a little bit before I close about the jobs, because I think the jobs is very important. In the next slide, we see that based on the web figure, 6.6 million jobs in ASEAN are projected to be redundant due to the technology. And 41% of this lack of essential skill required for also future jobs. So we really believe that this is something that we really have to pay attention. When we talk about the figure in Indonesia, this is also still a very big gap. And understanding the changes that industry 4.0 and society 5.0 will bring to Indonesia business world is very crucial. And I think this includes also the digital technologies and automation that the companies can adopt, also the jobs that will grow in the future, and the skill needed for the job, and how to develop this skill. I think the underlining is how do we develop this skill. And I think it's, the 4.0, 5.0 has different priorities, as we know. The 4.0 industry are developing to use technology to ease people activities, while the society 5.0 emphasize the use of technology while still relying on human as the main actors. However, I think they both are interconnected and complement each other in terms of technological development and social change. But I think alongside the machine, we have to see that the human aspect still provide an importance in terms of how we look at this. And I think we also look at the kind of future jobs, the 10 skill needed related to technological skill. I'm not going to go to details with this, but I think clearly we can see that the upscaling and rescaling what we need on what kind of jobs. And we've been talking to Minister Nadiem as well and providing, the right link and match. And it's been very difficult, but because even before this come to the picture, we know Indonesia now, some of the challenges that we face is the creation of jobs. And we look at, it's not just the kind of job, but also we don't even have enough job to create. So this is something that we are currently working with the minister also, how to find the right link and match, and how to really, businesses can really get involved in upscaling and rescaling. So I just want to close with two challenges that are very important, which is the human capital development, number one. I think we have to really pay attention the fact that those with education of elementary school is still 39.7%, followed by junior high school graduate is still 18%, senior high school is 19%, and vocational school is only 9%. So, this is something that we really, really need to pay attention. So while we talk about digitalization, we really need to know that even the basic Indonesia education system we're still very behind. And this also, I think, clearly said in the STEM, in the PISA exam, clearly notice the numbers that we are still very much behind. So we've been very much also promoting STEM these days, and trying to also put more STEM into the curriculum of, even when we look at the education side, how to expand the STEM graduates. And also the number two, which is the employment absorption. I just want to mention this because I think this is important, that we have to realize that in the next slide, that every investment that comes in now, the realization of workshop absorption per trillion has become smaller. And in 2023, only 826 workers were absorbed per 1 trillion. So there's now, compare of 9 years ago, that's only 20% compared to 9 years ago. So this is something that we really need to pay attention. So we've been very much promoting, next slide. Employment absorption, yes. We've been really much promoting also creating of SMEs sectors because of this, So if we can't create enough jobs on the industry, because moving from the labor intensive to the capital intensive, we also need to create more of the SMEs, but SMEs that can actually what I call scale up. Ladies and gentlemen, I think these are some of the aspects that APINDO has been focusing on. So I just want to close with the last slide, which is how do we move forward in the digital ecosystem chapter. We have, this is some of the recommendation that we provide to the candidates in our roadmap. So I'm not gonna, just to give you an idea that we want to promote deployment of high-speed internet infrastructure, launch national one-stop online portal that enables workshops of all age group to access online learning, establish national technology zone for business player, roll out MSME Go Digital program. So there's a few concrete program that we want to propose. And this is something, what we're doing, it's now working with the economic team. So what's important is a lot of the ideas, a lot of what, because we are the one who's working on the ground. So we know what's happening, we know what's needed, especially when we talk about the policy metrics. I don't share here, but there's specific namanya, aturan, which is regulations that really impacting. So it's to make it easier for candidates to also know what's actually happening, what works, what's not working. And this is something that I think is our contribution, and it is very, very important that we put it through to the candidate, not to the existing government, but to the candidates, so that they know how we think and how we can move forward with the business. So that's from me, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope this gives you a bit sense on where business is coming from and where we're heading. Thank you.
A warm round of applause. So, Ibu Shinta, actually, we really appreciate this presentation's timing, because I know yesterday was the day that APINDO was with all the three presidential candidates' teams. And she had a good chance to share what exactly are their programs by each of the three camps. And I'm very happy that you have a finger on the pulse and you're able to give us a lot of insight based on how you see the three camps are thinking about digital transformation. Thank you very much.